Alright, so today we're going to be talking about attributes in classes, mainly four functions that will help us understand or getting values of attributes and updating them in our classes. So let's get started. First thing first, what I want to do is create my students class. As you can see, I no longer have it. So class students def init, and then pass in self, name, age. Go ahead and set the attributes. Self.name is equal to name. Name. Self.age is equal to age. So that's an init function. I'm not going to put any other function after that because I just want to show you some quick simple functions we can use with attributes, and functions don't really have to do with anything there. Now I'm going to initialize student1. I'm going to set that equal to students, and then let's go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to do what's a good name? Fred. Fred's a fantastic name. So Fred, and age, let's do 17. Okay. So this is our student 1, and let's go ahead and make one more. Student 2, just for the fun of it. I mean, you don't really have to, but for the purpose of this lecture, it's fine. So Fred and Mike, and his age is 12. So we have student 1 and student 2, and the four functions I want to talk about today is, well, the first function at least is called has attribute or has attr. And all this function does is if it checks to see, does this attribute exist or not. For example, if I call the has attribute function on my student 1 and I say, hey, does my student 1 have the attribute age, then it returns true. I can then check for let's go ahead and check for grade. Does student 1 have a property called grade? So if we do call this function, it gives us false. So you can use this has attribute function to find out what attributes do your students have. And you're probably wondering, well, that's sort of pointless, right? Because we already know, since we have initialized the class with these main parameters, there's nothing else you can initialize it with. However, you're wrong there, because what you can do is you can set specific attributes for specific objects. For example, let's say for Fred example, student 1, Fred, let's say we also had to specify which grade he's in. So how do we do that? Right now, bringing student 1 down here, if I try adding a grade value, it's going to give me an error. It'll say, hey, init takes 3 positional arguments, but 4 were given. We don't have any argument for grade. So how do I add an attribute to my first object, grade? Or how do I add grade to my first object? Well, this is where our second function comes in. It's called set attribute, SET-ATTR. And all the set attribute does is it'll set an attribute to our class. So I can do is I can say set attribute student 1, and then I can say age, or for this class, grade, whatever you want to say, grade, and then it takes in the third argument, hey, what do you want to set it? So we're going to set it as 8th. Hopefully this works. Yes, it does. So now if I say has attribute student 1 grade, bring this down over here, whoops, it gives me true. Isn't that cool? So let's quickly recap what we just did. Has attribute checks to see, does this object have a specific attribute? Set attribute, on the other hand, can give or set specific attributes to your students. For example, if you have a list of employees, right? For some of them you're giving vacations, for some of them you're not. So instead of having to add the property vacations to your init function up top, and then for those who don't have vacations putting 0 every single time, for those few that actually have vacations, what you can do is set those attributes by calling this function. So again, set attribute is quite interesting. When you have specific or special objects that have those extra attributes, you can set them by using this. Now, let's say you wanted to return the value. So just like set and has, there's also a function called get. So all get attribute does, and it's just like what we've talked about before, is I can get any attribute I want by calling this function. So do I want to get the grade of student 1? I'll call get attribute student 1 comma grade. I'll get 8th. If I want to get the age of student 2, then I'll do student 2 and age. So this get attribute, I guess it's the exact same thing as calling student2.age, but I mean, it's just a different function to do it. You can do it both ways, doesn't really matter. Now, the last function I want to talk about is called the delete attribute. So just like there's setting, there's has, there's get, there is delete. So what if we're talking about grades here and you're like, oh, I don't need to add his grade anymore. How do we delete student 1's grade? Well, if you're a step ahead of me, it's going to be delete attribute and then student 1, comma, grade. So now if I try saying student 1, or let's call the has attribute now to see if it still has it, we'll get false. So these are the 4 main functions that you use with attributes: set, has, get, delete. All of them are very important, and you can just go ahead and play around with them. Again, we won't be using too much of these functions. I just wanted to show you, hey, these are what you can do with classes, this is what you can do with attributes, and so on. If you have any questions on how these functions work, or how are you setting these values, what is this init, stuff like that, please leave a discussion and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Now, in the next lecture, we'll again continue our sort of small tutorial with classes, and we'll just talk a little bit more about them. We'll slowly get to inheritance, parent class, child class, stuff like that. See you in the next lecture.